Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 23rd week of 2014. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion on the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Aram and Ron Szoke. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, occasionally even innocently, and then having our colleagues comment on them. Today is June 6, the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square protests in Beijing, China, in 1989. Having spent most of the last month in China, I want to talk about that. And incidentally, I came back from China and went immediately to two East Coast college reunions. I found the Ivy League more foreign than Beijing. In any case, today is also D-Day, the anniversary of the U.S.-UK invasion of occupied France in 1944. Also, it happens to be my parents' wedding anniversary in 1942, and the birthday of the late Alex Coburn, friend of this ground, in 1941. We'll read a contemporary comment from him a little later on Tiananmen Square. Normandy, the invasion of Normandy in 1944, is perhaps the most significant date in American political propaganda. U.S. hegemony was established by World War II because America emerged from the Second World War as the only undamaged country amongst the winners or the losers. The Normandy invasion has mythological status in our political imaginary, but it's important to remember that it was a sideshow in the war in Europe. From the invasion of Normandy in June of 1944 to the end of the war in 1945, the bulk of the German army, overwhelming bulk of the German army, remained on the Eastern Front fighting the Russians. The Russians, the USSR, won the Second World War, and they won it on the Eastern Front. In the West, the American armies managed to exercise that control over Western Europe that remained the issue for the U.S. in the post-war period. It was precisely the U.S. attempt to reestablish its economic hegemony in Europe that led to the Cold War, not the fantasy that the Russians, having destroyed the Nazis, were suddenly going to descend upon Paris and London and conquer all of Western Europe. This was American propaganda because, of course, that's exactly what the Americans were doing. In May of 1945, when the war ended, the Russians, who had lost perhaps 20 million people in the Nazi onslaught, the Russian army was in such a state, having done so much to destroy the German forces, the Russian army was in such a state that half of its mechanized divisions were the tanks and so forth, half of its mechanized divisions were horse-drawn. This is the army that faced the U.S. At the end of the war. It was American propaganda that the Russian threat required the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the American investment of Western Europe, investment in both senses, as a matter of fact, that was justified by the Cold War in the late 1940s. The invasion of Normandy then was as much a political act as anything else. One of the best historians of the invasion, John Keegan, points out that such an invasion would not be possible today because the Allies, having control of the airspace over the English Channel and so forth, were able to keep it secret. The Germans literally did not know where the American and British landings were going to take place. That's a world that's long gone, obviously. The form of attack that Normandy represented was succeeded by another American innovation, one that was about to take place in the Pacific, that is nuclear war. And that remains the only possibility of anything like Normandy in the world today. Paul Craig Roberts, who is a Reagan administration official who's been writing on national politics for some time, particularly defense matters, argues in a column this week that U.S. preparations for nuclear war against China and Russia are quite vigorous and quite advanced, and that our notion that such a thing is unthinkable, maybe true in one sense of the word, but it's certainly not unthinkable in the Pentagon and the Obama administration. They're thinking about it a lot. I'll have something more to say about Tiananmen Square and China later. In fact, it'll be hard to stop me. Become quite boring at dinner parties this week after my return from China. But for the now, we will press on with news from Neptune, the D-Day edition, inevitably. And we'll let Ron Szoke hit the beach first.
Yes. Well, I thought we might start by 2 minutes of ridiculing my pith helmet, but we'll skip that.
We want to take the pith out of Ron here.
Right. I thought I might introduce this topic, which I knew would come up due to the enormous blast of anti-Russian and anti-Chinese propaganda over the past couple of weeks in the so-called mainstream media or corporate media, and just mention two things that preceded it that most Americans have never heard about and are inclined to think maybe didn't exist because they haven't heard about. And yet nothing is being said about them. The Mexico City massacre of October 2nd, 1968. Mm-hmm. The official count of those killed was 4, but the observers say up to 3,000 died there. In the Plaza of the Three Cultures near the National Autonomous University in Mexico City. An amazing massacre, and yet almost nothing is heard about it or known about it in this country. There's reason to think that many more actually died there in the gunfire of the soldiers than in China, the protesting students there. Why the difference? Why the contrast? That's interesting, because one is useful, I suppose, for political propaganda, and the other one is not. And then, of course, there's the Kent State Massacre of May 4th, 1970. 4 killed, 9 wounded, one of them permanently paralyzed, and then the Jackson State killings on the same date. And yet nothing much is being said about those. Sometimes when people mention Tiananmen Square, others will say, well, what about Kent State? And then I've read arguments saying, well, those are completely different, and we can't mention them in the same breath. They're totally different situations. So it's interesting that they are, of course, somewhat different in their circumstances and consequences, but they're also, in other respects, the same. So I suspect we'll come back to Tiananmen Square. I want to take a different tack for a moment and talk about a recent article in the Wall Street Journal. The American dream is out of reach, say hardship-hit families. The American dream that we hear about so much, what is it? We never exactly find out. Is a national ethos of the United States, a set of ideals in which freedom includes the opportunity for prosperity and success and an upward social mobility achieved through hard work. So this article goes on to say, American dream, question mark, more like a pipe dream, according to a research report released Wednesday. The fresh poll from CNN ORC International shows that 59% of adults think the American dream has become impossible for most to achieve, up from 54% in a poll conducted in 2006. What's more, 63% of those surveyed believe most children in the U.S. grow up to be worse off than their parents. And that is a major change, it seems to me. For a long time, the correct thing to say was that I want to make a better life for my children. That's why I'm working hard at this factory job. And I need some Social Security. I need to pay for my children's college education. And so they can go on to have a better life, a more prosperous lifestyle than we ever had. This says older Americans were even more pessimistic, with 70% agreeing that kids who won't do as well as their parents, as opposed to 59% who agreed in the 18 to 34 and 35 to 49 brackets. A total of 1,003 adults were surveyed by telephone. Women were more downbeat than men. Just a day earlier, MarketWatch's Quentin Flettrell reported on new research showing that for more than half of Americans, 52%, have had to make at least one big sacrifice over the last 3 years just to be able to pay the rent or mortgage. That study also found that many don't associate the American dream with home ownership anymore. Some say that attitude is linked to still fresh memories and problems of the housing bust. Still, the CNN poll showed that 54% of those surveyed believe that they are better off financially than their parents were at their age, with 41% saying the opposite. Commenting on the findings, the director of Economic Mobility Project at the Pew Charitable Trust said the gloomy response reflects the hardship facing families. They are treading water, but their income is not translating into solid financial security, adding that only half have more wealth than their parents. We can contrast this then with the report in the local daily of what's happening at the other end of the scale. CEO pay continues to soar, and we're told that the highest paid CEOs, for example, their compensation, as it's called, their salaries are very low, but the nominal salary is almost meaningless. Neighbor Industries, which specializes in oil field services and the energy market. Andrew Petrollo, his pay went up 246%. Leslie Moonves of CBS went up 9%, from 60 million to 65 million. Richard Atkinson, Freeport McMoran, a mining company, up 294%. Stephen Coffer of TripAdvisor, 510%. Philip Dahman of Viacom, only 11%. Poor thing, up from 33 to 37 million. And then it goes on to tell you why the CEOs got a huge raise, but you didn't. It'd be interesting to go into that. But anyway, more straws in the wind here, I think. A statement from David K. Johnson, a very interesting reporter for the New York Times, has written several books about inequality, going back to Perfectly Legal, about all attempts to revise, simplify, and streamline the income tax system have had the same result, ultimately, of favoring the rich and taking money relatively away from the not rich. Inequality may spark unrest, Davos elites worry. So this is talking about one of the elite conferences, the one at Davos, high in the Swiss Alps of a few weeks ago. The most recent one is Bilderberg, of course, in Copenhagen the past couple of weeks, which is a very secret hush-hush affair. Apparently 2 reporters have been arrested for trying to find out too much, bugging people in the lobby and so on about what's going on inside there. But that's a fascinating topic in itself, these elite conferences and what goes on there and whether it has any significance, whatever. There's trouble coming. Johnson says, as the chasm between the richest of the rich and everyone else continues to widen, so says a report prepared for the World Economic Forum, the nonprofit foundation that hosts its annual conference of business leaders in Davos, Switzerland, popular with the world's billionaires. The forum's 14th annual assessment of risks, issued just ahead of the Davos gathering, makes clear that social instability, whether measured in mere riots or in bloody revolutions, is the likely outcome of increasing inequality. The report speaks of a lost generation of young people worldwide who are finishing school only to find a paucity of jobs, which in turn creates pressure to lower wages. Widening gaps, quoting, between the richest and poorest citizens threaten social and political stability as well as economic development, and so on. So another straw headline in RT, the Ukraine timeline appears there, which is a very interesting thing to read. A tiny elite and a huge proletariat are what's in store for the UK middle class, which is going to disappear in 30 years, this government advisor says. High property prices will wipe out the British middle class within the next 30 years, according to a UK government advisor. He says society will be left with a tiny elite and a huge sprawling proletariat, something I've alluded to here before, talking about the precariat and the planet of slums that seems to be before us. Quoting, the really scary thing is if in the next 30 years house prices rise as much as they have done in the past 30 years, then the average house in Britain will cost 1.2 million pounds, or the United States 2 million, said David Boyle, a British author and government advisor, who's a fellow of the New Economics Foundation. So that means that housing will become unaffordable for almost everyone if this prophecy proves true. So on and on it goes. People say if you're worried about the inequality, then you're just envious, and the rising tide of economic growth will lift all boats. This one says actually it lifts all yachts, and the small boats are being swamped, not to mention the people who are paddling desperately to stay on the surface. So this has many ramifications in many directions, but I'll stop. Interesting article by George Monbiot on the impossibility of growth demands a new economic system. What he means by growth is exponential growth, which of course is impossible in any real world, actual physical system. The so-called hockey stick graph or the compound interest principle. But that's one of those things that can't continue and therefore will not. So we have to start facing the implications of that. And with that cheerful thought, I'll stop.
Thank you, Ron. Reaction to any of this, Karen?
Yes, actually, a couple of things. One, I read that same article by Mr. Is it Monkgrout? And it is an excellent article. I'm glad you read it because I didn't feel adequate to discussing it, but yeah. Okay, first I want to make a point in relation to something, Carl, you said about the Pentagon being concerned about military buildup. And I spent 5 minutes switching through stations on TV the other day and came upon C-SPAN, which I have never seen. I've never watched C-SPAN, never interested. But when I saw the headline that said missile defense, I couldn't pass it up. So I viewed this missile defense discussion that some of our illustrious representatives were having, and it was a bit chilling. I simply want to say that everything was in relation to, now what I was getting was China, okay? And all I kept thinking was, this is unbelievable. You know, here we are, you know, doing business in China. Most of our major corporations have a presence there, and yet we're talking about a buildup, our Pentagon buildup in relation to this nation. And I also had a chance, an opportunity to view a video, okay? It was done by Bruce Gagnon in 2003 Noam Chomsky make some comments, and I will repost that because he talks about our relation to, the title is our relation, Pentagon relation to NASA, but it takes you up, like I said, that was 2003, it takes you up to present day, and boy, we are there, okay? What they were predicting in 2003, we're there now. Another comment I want to make is in respect to the 1968 Mexican City Massacre. Yeah, I'd never heard of that, nor had I ever heard of the Jackson State killings until quite recently.
Wow.
Because, of course, the 1970 Kent State killings I'm highly familiar with, being a student at the time, and I'm from Ohio. And so that was very well known. But never heard about the Jackson State killings.
Well, some say there's a
Why?
reason for that. All
I
those
know
killed
there's a
were black.
reason.
Right.
Well, yes, because they were black, and people, I don't know if people realize how segregated our society was at that time. Okay, now on the American Dream, what you were referring to, this is interesting because I spoke to both of my daughters who are in the San Francisco area, both of whom have degrees in higher education and incomes and what you would call a very good income, okay? So I bemoaned the fact that I knew that they did not have the American dream as my generation did. And I was struck by how, one, I was disappointed that they were like, well, no, we, and they were referring to a lot of their friends, colleagues, and people that they know in the same situation, but they felt that they had to, adapt to society as it is today. But they're also not very materialistic in that having a house or having a car, these were not, material possessions were of no interest to them. Now, I'm also very disappointed because my attitude is this is something you want to resist because you could find yourself, especially in a very expensive area. They also have colleagues and friends in New York City. So you may be able to afford the expensive rent you're paying right now. But what if you lose your job? What if you end up without that income? You've got nothing, literally. So I was, pleased that they're less materialistic than my generation, but at the same time very disappointed that they don't feel the need to fight the system as I think that they should.
Why do you think there's a difference, Karen? I mean,
Maybe
if such a difference exists, what happened? Now, you think that you're taking these two positions as typical, too. It's not just...
No, it's not typical. It may be typical in their environment where they have, where most of the people they know have employment.
They're millennials, as the
yes,
as the
let's
media
say in their late 20s, 30s,
Right.
early 40s.
Okay.
What I fear is that if they were to suddenly lose their income and say move here or anywhere else in the U.S. where job opportunities are far less, and even, let's face it, Silicon Valley, it has its ups and it has its downs. And I'm not saying that they're not realistic about what is happening and they're concerned about the environment. I think their biggest concern is the environment, not the politics as much, but they recognize the politics related to the environment. But even though they're in an environment where resistance is known, I mean, they have demonstrations all the time, and they participate, they just feel that their survival is no longer, let's put it this way, their desires are no longer the idea of what we refer to as the American dream.
You're suggesting that they're more politically quiescent than your generation was?
I'm not sure, but perhaps some are naive in that they feel they have to be, but maybe
why do they feel that way?
Because maybe they don't see any real hope out there because they know what's they know what the future holds in relation to the environment.
Well,
and they've been activists, so they put aside the desires that I think our generation may have had. But it also may have to do with, I mean, what I'm saying is that there are many different factors involved. It's not just income, it's not just education, environment, it's many, many things.
The principal one may be much closer to home. I mean, we remember that our generation, if I'm allowed to speak that way, grew up in a great deal more comfort
Right.
overall than this generation has, and that's a big difference. I mean, it's not been lost upon the current generation that the massive college debts that this generation has been taking on is a way of keeping them in line.
Right.
When you and I got out of college,
Right.
if we owed any money at all, it was not worth thinking about. If
Exactly.
we'd gotten some financial aid, sure, we'll pay it off at one point. But since there was a job out there for us regardless, and the payments were small, it wasn't an issue.
Right.
For this generation, it's a very big issue indeed, and the results are, I think, are not far to seek. We have a generation through 10 years of a decade of war here that has been remarkably quiet compared with the generation of the 60s,
Right.
as we say in American politics. That's not an accident. That's constructed. That's organized.
Exactly.
And that's the reason we don't have free higher education, as many countries, less overwhelmingly rich than the United States, have without a second thought.
Well, I read something this morning on my monthly radio show about simplicity and so on, about the system wanting you to be in debt.
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
And it enormously increases control over the masses.
I think that's a crucial
The three
point.
main kinds, of course, being student debt, which we've mentioned, credit card debt, and medical debt. All three of them are just overwhelming. And everybody's in debt. I don't like this way of talking about the system wants you to be in debt, if you can make any sense of that. I don't like attributing psychological states to abstract entities. But anyway,
Called
insofar
reasons.
as you can make that, make any sense out of that, it's quite true.
Yep.
That that's one reason everybody's in debt is because the whole system is set up to make you that way.
And in absolute figures, the greatest of these three is student debt,
Right,
remarkably
right.
enough,
Now-
which now exceeds all credit card
Yeah.
debt in this country.
Right.
It's astonishing.
Right. Now, some of the people that I'm talking about, because I raised that issue about debt, but they're in positions where they don't have debt, okay? They don't have the student debt, they don't have credit card debt, and they have good health insurance. So they're also young and healthy. So they're not recognizing, and they don't even expect Social Security to last. It's almost like, well, we can't
Which is
depend upon
also
Social
propaganda.
Security.
I mean, 'cause of course
exactly,
it will, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So, and if I were just speaking about a couple people, but there's this whole chain or group within which they. But like I said, I do feel that I agree with everything you're saying about the younger generation being saddled with debt. But then when I talk to some who are living in a little more comfort and don't really see, what the future holds, they just feel that it's up to them to be more disciplined and to lower their material expectations.
Do they aspire to buy a house?
No, that's what I'm saying. They don't ever expect to buy a house. They don't even drive cars. It's like, why? Because it's just a pollutant. But they also live in places where public transportation doesn't require you to own a car. So that's what I'm saying. There are differing communities throughout, but I found it disappointing because I'm like, you should be angry,
Do they expect to have children who will be sent to college?
No. They don't expect to have children. There are a lot of them out there that are saying, no, we're not having children because they see the world that they'd be bringing the children into. So that's what I'm saying. We have a segmented society of young people, and it's really sad. But I've talked to others even in this environment who live at home with mom and dad, and they know that they forget about getting a house unless they inherit it. Even if they marry, they probably won't have children because why bring children into this environment? So, yeah, it's...
What we're talking about here, of course, is the fact that these folks the media talks of as millennials, folks who are born in the 80s roughly, are the recipients of an economic situation, of a political economic situation that is in fact regnant neoliberalism. They've grown up in a neoliberal economic order, and the factors we're talking about here are a result of 40 years of neoliberalism. It's important and largely unrecognized, I think, in most of our punditry. Even in the early days of the rise of neoliberalism, I used to point out to my classes that when someone of my advanced age graduated from college, he could count on getting a job that would allow him to buy a house and a car,
Right.
Take a wife. So other changes here too, but
Or-
and live and have children, as you say,
Right.
all on one salary.
Right.
And
Oh, right.
my
Exactly.
students of even a generation ago would look at me in disbelief. But I said, look at the figures. This was the situation in the 60s.
Right.
And this was the background, by the way, of the political activism that we speak of as the 60s. These things were taken care of.
Yeah.
One could count on that, and it's been a confiscation of the middle-class lifestyle with the vastly increasing economic inequality in the country that has changed the mind
Right.
that you're talking about. It's not an accident. It's been done consciously, and
Yep.
the effects are there for all to see.
Right. Carl, can I interrupt you a minute? I want to finish my time and ask you about your trip to China, because Beijing, because that's been, I'm very interested in hearing about it. So I'd like to jump over to that right
Okay.
now, if possible.
All right.
Could you tell us a bit first about this conference and your, what was this conference that you went there for and your role?
I spent 2 weeks in China with a group of American shrinks, primarily, psychoanalysts, psychotherapists, mental health professionals, and others, who are involved in an investigation that might be brutally summarized as the psychoanalysis of groups. How do groups behave, particularly if one pays attention to the unconscious processes in groups. My wife and I got involved with these shrinks 30 years ago when they were doing this work, because it seemed to me, to my wife as a sociologist and me as a historian, that these folks were onto some things that it was worthwhile to know about politically. I mean, we did it consciously because we were interested in what political things actually had emerged from the 60s. So that was where we started. The group, the tradition is called within the mental health business the Tavistock method of examining groups, and it's carried on primarily by the A.K. Rice Institute in this country, based in Washington. And it was a Rice Institute conference in Beijing that took us there in the first place. We were working as shrinks in this conference. The conference is designed to provide for a group. We had about 60 members in this conference, 60 Chinese members in this conference, to provide for the groups the sort of, in the jargon, regressive experience that a psychoanalytic session provides for an individual. And our roles were essentially the roles of the analyst, but instead of having one patient on the couch, we had a group of 60 people, not always on the couch, but in our vicinity, and our attempt was to try to say what was happening to this group.
So it's an attempt to apply Freudian concepts directly to groups?
Yes.
And to groups of a
Yes.
different culture?
We'd have to give a good account of it. Yes, actually, and you both are quite right. Freudian concepts, now, there's a lot of blood over the dam since Freud's time, right? So, in fact, the concepts are modified in a lot of ways, and it makes an interesting discussion. But yes, basically Freudian concepts. The cross-cultural things turned out to be the most interesting part. I started today by saying that the most foreign culture I've been in the last month or two was in Princeton, New Jersey. But in any case, China had its own questions raised about that. Questions turned out primarily to be the questions about the assumptions that the Americans took to China. And these assumptions, which are drawn from American propaganda, were wildly inaccurate. But all my American friends, I mean, our colleagues were American mental health professionals, as I said. So they're not historians, not sociologists, not politically particularly interested people. But the attitudes they brought to China were quite surprising and indeed shocking. Mainly, the principal attitude amongst my American colleagues was that they were coming into a Stalinist society of repression in which citizens were afraid of their government and were constantly under police surveillance and control, and the fear of that authoritarian regime was paramount in the society, and that if we were going to talk about groups in that society, we had to keep that in mind. Well, I suggested that my colleagues were participating in what the shrinks themselves would call projection, that is, describing their own situation and applying it to others, and that they were completely misreading what they were finding in China. That's, to dwell on that for a moment, if you think about I mentioned before the program came on that the one book that came back to me most in China, particularly as I was wandering through the grounds of the Summer Palace in Beijing, was a novel, George MacDonald Fraser's historical novel set at the time of the Second Opium War, called Flashman and the Dragon. And I think it's an example of how the poets often get there first, that what Fraser has done is, with an immense detailed attention to the history of the period, is given us a better picture, in some sense, of China as it was in the 19th century, and just as America in the 19th century influences our America today, so the same is true in China. But the second revelation that came to me was how different things were from the picture of China that we Americans took there. The differences in Chinese and American history from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century are immense, and we're aware of them. I mean, from the Taiping Rebellion in the middle of the 19th century, roughly contemporaneous with the U.S. Civil War, but much more destructive, I might say, to the triumph of the Communist Party in the 1940s in China, and the triumph of the Capitalist Party, we might say, in the Western world at large after the Second World War in America, the histories are quite different. And the period from the 1950s to the 1970s, the golden age of capitalism as we see it now in this country, was a period in which both regimes consolidated themselves and established their hegemony. That's what the Cold War was about for the United States, and the Chinese development in this period was also a consolidation of the rule of the Communist Party. But the development in the next 40 years, from the mid-70s to the present, shows a very different pattern. It seems to me that in this period, in the last 40 years, Chinese society and American society has converged remarkably. Both societies keep up their cover stories. The Chinese society the Chinese polity continues to say it's communist, in that the Communist Party is the dominant element. The American polity continues to say it's democratic, but we know they both are lying. Neither is true. We have a sham democracy in this country, and you have at best sham communism in China. What you have in both countries, and they look remarkably alike in this regard, is an oligopolistic neoliberal polity. That neoliberalism has triumphed in both societies. And if you'd like a sketch of this, I can recommend nothing better than David Harvey's Brief History of Neoliberalism, which came out in 2005, before the Great Crisis of 2007-9. And in that, he points out that neoliberalism in the societies can be dated from the almost concurrent rise of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Deng Xiaoping. and that they did for their societies essentially the same thing. They presided over the introduction of the completion of a neoliberal order in which the social services promised by the previous regime were set aside, and the barriers to the exploitation of the population in the interests of the very rich were correspondingly lessened. That's neoliberalism, and that's what triumphed in both East and West. And what we saw when we get to Beijing today, is remarkably similar, mutatis mutandis, because it is the triumph of neoliberalism. So there's my you asked. You have only yourself to blame.
Right. Well, okay. I want to make just two comments here. First of all, having lived in Asia for 30 years, I only lived in Shanghai for 2. I've had many. There's a certain arrogance when we try to apply our cultural expectations to another culture. And
like Princeton. Yeah.
Well, this is, and I'll just give you one example of a European client that I had that after interviewing a Thai candidate who was excellent every way, but he was a little concerned that this gentleman was rather modest and didn't ask him any questions. And I had to point out to my client that this is Thailand. The one thing they despise is boastfulness or aggressiveness. So on an interview, he will be very modest because you're senior, and therefore he will attempt to only answer questions. He won't make a strong effort to ask questions. This is one very small example, but I've had 14 years of experience dealing with international clients and candidates generally, not always, but generally of Asian descent. Another thing I do want to point out is that there has been some programming in China. And now let me explain what I mean by this. It isn't the brainwashing that we assume. What it is, because you'll see people out in the streets. I can't tell you how many times I saw people out there fighting with the police, okay? Because the policemen were telling them to move their bicycle or move their car. And they'd get out and they'd be arguing and demanding their rights that they weren't going to move it. And I thought, wow, I wouldn't argue with a policeman here in America. They might pull out their gun and shoot me. But one of the things that I noticed was that if I went to work at 8 o'clock, between 7:30 and 8, it was always empty, except you'd see the elderly in the parks doing their morning ritual of Tai Chi. Am I saying it? Tai Chi? Tai Chi. Tai Chi. Chai Tea. Sorry, yeah, Tai Chi is something else.
I did Tai Chi every day I was in China.
Right, every morning.
With a bad back.
But if I went in early at 7, I noticed many of the elderly were all around the streets in front of my building where I worked. They were all out there congregated, socializing. But as soon as a certain time hit, they disappeared. I mean, it was like clockwork. And I think it was 7. I think it was at 7. Now, it might have been 8. I've forgotten now. But it was like clockwork. Bang, they just disappeared.
Like Americans leaving work at 5,
and
huh?
Many of my colleagues noted the same thing because they came in later. And it was kind of like, scary, Twilight Zone. We're all the elderly people. You did not see any elderly working, okay, at jobs. That was disturbing. Everyone in Shanghai that was working, everywhere you went, were young, okay? Jobs were for the young. But we also recognize that that's because the older people didn't have the English language and they didn't have the job skills.
Oh, they were home taking care of the kids, too.
Well, at this point in time, they were home taking care of the kids, but they also at one time had experience being out in the fields, okay, agriculture. However, I said, you know what, I think there has been some programming. They are not just going home to take care of the children, who are taking care of the grandchildren, which is the role usually of the Asian grandparents. They go home, stay at home, take care of the grandchildren. But there's more to it than that. I asked people, I asked the Chinese about this, and they explained it to me that sometimes we would get announcements telling us that there were certain things we should do. This was in the past mostly, such as it's okay to take leftovers from the restaurant after you eat. They said because traditionally they would find, they would feel like it was impolite to take leftovers home. I'm serious. I didn't know that. Some places,
No
boy,
doggy
they just
bags?
no doggy bags. The government told them it's
The British feel the same way.
Yeah.
You know, I
It's-
tried to do that in
yeah.
a London restaurant. My friends practically turfed me out. I mean,
Exactly. So they were actually told, you know, so there was an announcement that would go out, it's okay. Now, during the Olympics, they were told, please do not walk around on the streets in your pajamas, which was a very common occurrence for people, to just go outside in their pajamas and, you know, chat with their neighbor, whatever, because they're clothed, so they don't see anything wrong with wearing pajamas. But the foreigners are coming, so we want everything to look nice, so they tell them not to wear their pajamas. But this is so mild, this is so moderate, and it's about opening up to, and don't spit on the sidewalk, you know, that's the kind of thing. But it's, as I said, I've spent enough time with them, trust me. These people talking politics, arguing and discussing things and asking them questions about their history. The only thing I did discover was that the young ones in their early 30s, 20s, if you ask them about the Tiananmen Square massacre, they're like, well, I heard something about it. But they usually don't care because they're busy working.
And you didn't hear anything at all about the Mexico City massacre. As Ron
There
pointed
you
out,
go.
so,
Exactly, exactly.
The thing that surprised me most in China was the attitude of my fellow American visitors. These Americans that I was traveling and working with in this conference were sure that they were dealing with a populace that was terrified of its government and feared that a misstep would get them into police hands where they would be treated badly. This is what the Americans believed, the Chinese believed, eh?
Totally
We
wrong.
had some independent evidence while we were there. Amnesty International came out with a survey that it had taken in 21 countries around the world, some 20,000 people apparently interviewed, in which they asked whether, in all these countries, they asked whether they feared they would be tortured if taken into custody by their own government. The numbers are interesting. You know which country won the poll? That is, citizens were most certain they would be tortured if taken in custody by the government? You'll never guess. Ron, you got to
Somalia.
guess? Ron, you got to guess? You might guess.
Somalia?
No?
USA,
Brazil.
Brazil. Yeah.
Brazil, you know, which has had a quote leftist government, you know, for a while.
Right,
But that
right.
was But the interesting thing was, of course, Americans were far more convinced that they might be tortured by their own government in custody than Chinese were. The numbers weren't even close. Now, the difference, the importance seems to me not so much what Amnesty International found, but the attitudes of my American friends, which were so contrary to what to the facts as the poll revealed it. These Americans knew what they were going to find in China. And I think it affected their work in China. And we had some rather strenuous discussions on this matter. It's striking to see how much alike, it seems to me, Beijing and Los Angeles are. And that surprised me. But there were ways in which I thought my colleagues couldn't see it.
Probably not.
What's notorious, what amuses me is when American reporters go to Cuba, as soon as they hit the ground, they go start looking for dissidents who are being repressed by the government. That's all they can think of.
Well, I think you put your finger on a crucial point, Ron, because it was exactly the Americans responding to American propaganda about China. That, and look, these perfectly intelligent people I went with, but they were not people whose primary concern was politics or primary concern was psychology. But what they carried with them was the precipitate of U.S. propaganda about China, and it took a great deal of trouble to begin to suggest that maybe that misled them. So that was an important lesson, it seemed to me.
Well, I've spoken several times on AWARE, and one of the things that I pointed out is that in China, and I remember having this discussion just recently, regarding increasing wages, which they are increasing wages in China, because they want to keep their people happy. Now, some people think that sounds ridiculous, and I'm being a bit sarcastic, but they do want to keep their people fed and satisfied. Because, and David Johnson pointed out that, oh, they have so many demonstrations, they have so many protests, and it's true. They have far more than what we have here or anywhere else in the world. And the Chinese government knows, the communist government knows that if they want to keep power, they do have to keep the people satisfied in some respect. So, yeah, and I thought, here we are, look how we're fighting to increase wages here, and it's so difficult, and our congressmen just kind of ignore us. As we're in China, they are increasing wages, and some international companies are leaving as a result, looking for other other production sites, so to speak. So
I have another observation from the other foreign culture that I've recently been investigating, and here again I'm shocked at the attitudes of the people that I encounter, the people as in China who are most like me, the folks I traveled with in China, the folks I traveled with in Princeton, New Jersey. What amazed me about the folks at this Ivy League reunion was that no one had heard of Thomas Piketty.
are you kidding me?
No, I'm not kidding you at all.
That's
I mean,
the
yeah,
biggest
this is
book
now. This is
sales-
not a scientific survey. I didn't take a survey, but it does like my experience in Beijing. It does indicate where people's attention is lodged, or more importantly, how their attention has been formed. The immense impact of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, about the raging inequality in contemporary society and the reasons for its perdurance, was just not part of the intellectual atmosphere of these people, many of whom are quite wealthy and well-to-do in the system that is producing hourly and daily this vast inequality. And I was quite astonished, because I expected arguments, people
Right.
quoting the Financial Times attempt to take apart some of Piketty's numbers, the Forbes critique and so forth. No, they didn't have to at all. They'd never heard of it. I was,
can't
once
believe
again,
that.
I was astonished twice by
Yeah.
Americans in the last month.
That's well, I was going to say, they say that is the biggest seller Amazon has ever had. Books.
Not apparently in Princeton, New Jersey or Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Unbelievable. Well, that's rather telling then.
Yeah. Another symptom is this letter I got from our Congressman, Rodney Davis. I wrote one of these petitions, or signed a petition about raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. While I understand and share the goal of raising people out of poverty, I do not believe that people enter into minimum wage jobs and think that's going to be a career. What? It is a career for a whole lot of people.
Of course.
My family achieved the American dream because my dad had a dream to go beyond the minimum wage and own his own restaurant.
God,
This
this
is
guy.
rich.
Hey, this guy has got to go.
Yeah.
he's
I fear that the increasing the minimum wage will be a roadblock to people from pursuing a higher earning career like my dad, and will actually cause more people to lose their jobs.
We've got to post this. We've got to post this somewhere. So people in Illinois now, and he represents
Us.
all he's our representative
Yes,
in this
yeah.
district or in the whole member of Congress. Yeah. Oh God. Unbelievable.
We'll conclude today with an account of the Tiananmen Square events of 25 years ago from the late Alexander Cockburn. I think it's extremely appropriate, Ron, that you started with the Mexico City massacre in 1968 and compared and contrasted it with Tiananmen Square in 1989. And Karen is wonderful that someone as sophisticated and well-traveled as you and so forth. We're not familiar with the Mexico City massacre.
Right.
That's the point. Chomsky.
Well, it was in '68. I
That's
was
right.
not as sophisticated and well-traveled at that time as I
Well,
am
but
now.
it's. I mean, look, there's.
But you're right. I only found out about it I think a year or two ago, from maybe Democracy Now! Or something like that. And I was
40
like,
years ago, Noam Chomsky wrote an article about benign and constructive bloodbaths,
Right.
and contrasted them with bloodbaths that were not benign and constructive. Benign and constructive are those which tell in the direction of American policy. And of course, at the top of the list is Chile in '73.
Right.
The first 9/11,
That I knew
as we
about.
say, which was constructive from the point of view of American propaganda and indeed American policy, since we put it together. But the reading of Tiananmen Square and the demonstrations of June 1989 seems to me to fall into that American attitude constructed by American propaganda, and it needs some corrective. And I would be happy to see out of this week some of that corrective begin to arrive. Here's what Alex Coburn wrote in that month, in June of '89, about what was going on in Tiananmen Square. Transfixed by 1 million people in Tiananmen Square, the press seems unfazed by the fact that though some students plainly want capitalist democracy, others sing the Internationale, the communist anthem. Workers carry pictures of Mao. But then these journalists don't seem to notice very much. How come if Deng Xiaoping has been the most hated man in China, we had to wait for 1 million people to tell us the news? Speaking as one who has stood in a crowd of 1 million people, the demonstration in favor of a nuclear freeze held on June 12, 1982 in New York Central Park, I don't recall the press here getting quite as excited at the turnout. Some millions are more millionish than others. I hope Deng goes down and his whole crowd with him. They promoted market relations within an authoritarian state, which is fascism. Now, this is Coburn writing in '89, when the word neoliberal was not yet fashionable. But that's what he's talking about. They promoted market relations within an authoritarian state, which is fascism, that is to say, neoliberalism. At least Gorbachev, writes Coburn in '89, is going at it the other way around. The past decade has spelled long-term misfortune for most Chinese peasants and workers. Thatcherization in the countryside, and that, once again, neoliberalism, has led, as William Hinton observed in the Monthly Review for March, he's written one of the best books about coming of communism to China, to a dispersal of social assets so great that it is doubtful if in the history of the world any privileged group acquired more for less. Now, we're used to that with the Soviet Union, but here we're giving an account of it's happening, neoliberalism coming to China. The privileged in this case are those, mostly party functionaries, urged to the pillage by the leadership, best positioned to loot the public economy. Once again, exactly what happened certainly strikingly similar to what happened in the old Soviet Union in its transition. The situation in Tiananmen Square, then, seems to me to give us a basis for thinking about Chinese and American society as they have developed over the last 40 years, away from the propaganda and in the actual direction that they're going. And indeed, it's the unknown Thomas Piketty, unknown in Princeton, New Jersey, who seems to me to be giving a very good account of that, based upon the starting point that David Harvey sketched out in A Brief History of Neoliberalism. That's what we're seeing in America today, 25 years after Tiananmen Square, and we're seeing it in China as well. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 23rd week of 2014, an inevitable D-Day edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been Aram and Ron Szoke. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and see our Facebook page. I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake Jason and our former producer-director, Caleb Serapinas. We also want to remind you, if you're in Champaign-Urbana, that there is a demonstration tomorrow afternoon at May and Neal Streets from 2 to 4 p.m. against the war policy of the American government. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.